The retirement watch caught the light perfectly under the display case's halogen bulbs. 22-karat gold, custom engraved, the kind of timepiece a man keeps in a velvet box and passes to his grandchildren someday. I'd been studying it for nearly 10 minutes, while the jeweler waited with the patient smile of someone who understood that men my age don't rush decisions like this. 62 years of building things had taught me that the details always matter most. My son's 50th birthday was 3 weeks away, and after everything we'd built together at Callaway Design Group, 40 years of my sweat, the last 8 of his, he deserved something that lasted. Something that said, "I see you. I trust you. This company will be yours when I'm ready." I gave the jeweler my credit card and felt the particular satisfaction of a decision made cleanly, without regret. My phone buzzed inside my sport coat. I assumed it was my office manager confirming the Thursday site visit in Oak Park. I glanced at the screen without thinking. The number was unfamiliar. Chicago area code, but nothing I recognized. The message read, "Don't sign anything at the party. They've already spoken to your attorney. I'll explain everything, but please don't sign." I read it twice. Then a third time. The jeweler handed back my card and slid the gift box across the glass counter, and I signed the receipt with hands that had gone completely still. "Sir, did you need a gift bag?" Her voice came from somewhere far away. "No," I said. "Thank you." I walked out of the shop onto Michigan Avenue with the watch box tucked under my arm and the phone tight in my grip. November in Chicago cuts right through you even on a clear day, but I didn't feel the cold. I stood on the sidewalk with foot traffic splitting around me like water around a stone, staring at a message from a number I didn't recognize, sent by someone who apparently knew my plans for a party I'd only finalized 2 weeks ago. I dialed the number immediately. It rang 7 times. No voicemail. No answer. I tried again, walking toward the parking garage. Same result. Whoever had sent that message had no intention of picking up, at least not yet. They were controlling this. I understood that instinctively. Decades of negotiating contracts with developers and city planners had sharpened my ability to recognize when someone was managing the pace of a conversation. They would call when they were ready, not before. The drive back to Evanston took 40 minutes through midday traffic. I spent most of it with one hand on the wheel and my mind sorting through what little I actually knew. Someone had my personal cell number. Someone knew about the birthday party. Someone knew my attorney had been contacted, and the phrase, "don't sign anything," implied there was something specific waiting for my signature. At the party. I'd been planning to make it official at the dinner. The transfer of managing partner status, the formal elevation of my son to chief executive. The paperwork had been sitting on my attorney's desk for 3 weeks. I'd told my son it was coming. I'd told his wife. I'd even told my 2 junior partners, quietly, over lunch in September. Everyone who mattered knew. So who was warning me, and why? The office was quiet when I arrived. My assistant told me I had a 4 o'clock call with the Dearborn Street client and handed me a stack of contract revisions. I took them to my desk and sat down without reading a single page. Through the window, Lake Michigan looked like hammered pewter under the November sky. I'd had this view for 31 years. I'd chosen the building specifically for this window because I knew I'd spend a great deal of my life staring out of it, thinking. I was doing that now. My son had joined the firm at 28, sharp, ambitious, and hungry in the way only the children of self-made men ever are, like they understand the weight of the inheritance before they've even touched it. I'd watched him grow from a kid who couldn't read a blueprint without squinting into a designer whose instincts I genuinely respected. His wife had worked in corporate law for 11 years before leaving to manage their household. Together, they were the kind of couple that made other couples feel slightly inadequate at dinner parties. I'd been proud of them. I was still proud of them, or I had been until approximately 45 minutes ago. I dialed the unknown number again from my office phone. This time it rang twice before going to a generic voicemail prompt. No name, no recorded greeting, just the beep. "This is Richard Callaway," I said carefully. "You sent me a message today. I'd appreciate a conversation. Please call me back." I hung up and looked at my watch, my own watch, the one I'd worn for 20 years, a simple Omega that my late wife had given me the year we finally paid off the building mortgage. She would have known exactly what to do right now. She had a gift for seeing through the surfaces of situations that I'd always quietly relied on and never adequately acknowledged while she was alive. 3 years since the funeral. Some days it still felt like the ground hadn't finished settling. My 4 o'clock call came and went. I gave appropriate answers and committed to nothing. Afterward, I sat in the near dark of my office and thought about the party. 47 people. The private dining room at Spiaggia, the one on the second floor with the view of Oak Street Beach. My son's closest friends, our longest-running clients, both junior partners, a handful of architects from the broader Chicago design community who'd become genuine friends over the years. I'd arranged for a string quartet to play during cocktail hour. I'd chosen the menu myself. The ceremony, if you could call it that, was to happen after dinner. A short speech from me, followed by the signing of the partnership transfer documents, followed by champagne. I'd imagined it as a moment of grace. A father stepping back at the right time, with dignity and intention, handing over the thing he'd built to the person he'd raised to continue it. The phone on my desk lit up at 6:47. The same unknown number, Mr. Calloway, a woman's voice, careful, measured, with the particular flatness of someone choosing every word. "I'm sorry for the way I reached out today. I needed to know you'd seen the message before I called. Who are you?" A pause. "My name is Diane Marsh. I'm a paralegal. I worked at Hendricks and Foley until about 6 weeks ago. Hendricks and Foley, my attorney's firm." I kept my voice steady. "What happened 6 weeks ago?" "I left," she said. "I left because of something I was asked to do that I wasn't comfortable with. I want to be very clear. I'm not calling you for money, and I'm not calling you because of any grievance with the firm. I'm calling you because I have a daughter your son's wife's age, and if someone had this information about my father, I would want them to call him." I pulled a legal pad from my desk drawer and uncapped a pen. "Tell me," I said. What she told me over the next 22 minutes rearranged everything. My son's wife had retained Hendricks and Foley, my own attorney's firm, for a separate matter 7 months ago. Not unusual on its face. The firm had multiple partners and handled a broad range of clients. But the matter she'd retained them for was not separate at all. It was a corporate restructuring strategy, one that involved Callaway Design Group. Diane had processed the documents herself. She described them with the careful precision of someone who had rehearsed this conversation many times before making the call. A framework for absorbing Callaway Design into a new holding entity, majority controlled by my son and his wife jointly, structured in a way that would dilute my remaining equity to a minority position within 18 months of the initial transfer. Minority positions in closely held firms like mine come with limited voting rights. The documents also included what she described as a cognitive capacity clause, standard language in some estate transfers, she said, but unusual in a straightforward partnership agreement, giving the majority holders authority to make unilateral decisions if the minority holder was deemed unable to participate meaningfully in governance. Deemed by whom, exactly, was left deliberately vague. "The party," I said. "The documents I was planning to sign. The partnership transfer you've described to your attorney is not the only set of documents he's prepared," she said. "There are supplemental agreements." "Mr. Calloway." I reviewed them. The language is embedded in pages 12 through 18 of what looks like a standard operating agreement. Most people would sign without reading that section carefully. I set down the pen. I'd spent 40 years reading contracts. I'd trained my son to read contracts. And apparently, someone had decided to bet on the idea that a 67-year-old man at his son's birthday party, surrounded by friends and champagne and the warm feeling of doing the right thing, might not read pages 12 through 18 of an operating agreement. They might have been right. "Is there anything else?" My voice was very quiet. She hesitated. There were phone records included as an exhibit to an internal memo. I don't know the full context, but the memo discussed the possibility of they used the phrase gradual transition of decision-making authority. There were notes about incidents. What kind of incidents? Instances where you had allegedly shown confusion or poor judgment, client disputes, billing errors. A meeting in which you supposedly couldn't recall the terms of a long-standing contract. She paused. I cross-referenced the billing records for the clients mentioned. Several of those disputes were resolved in your favor. One of them involved a client who later filed a complaint against your son's division of the firm. They were building a file. My hands were steady as I thanked her and wrote down her contact information. I asked if she would be willing to speak to a different attorney, one not connected to Hendricks and Foley, and she said she would consider it. I didn't push. I told her she had done a decent thing and that I wouldn't forget it. After we hung up, I sat for a long time in the dark office with the city glittering below me. My son's 50th birthday party was 19 days away. I had 19 days. I called my accountant at 7 the next morning. Harris Brennan had managed my personal and business finances for 16 years and possessed the invaluable quality of never asking more questions than were necessary. I told him I needed a complete independent valuation of Callaway Design Group's assets and equity structure, and I needed it treated as confidential from every other party, including the firm's current legal counsel. Harris asked if everything was all right. I told him I was doing some estate planning and wanted updated numbers. He said he'd have a preliminary figure within a week. My next call was to Patricia Lowe, an attorney I'd worked with on a zoning dispute in Wicker Park 4 years ago. She was meticulous, expensive, and had the professional temperament of someone who had heard every variety of human dishonesty and was no longer capable of being surprised by any of it. I explained the situation in broad terms and told her I would send her the specific documents Diane had described as soon as I could obtain copies without alerting anyone. Patricia was quiet for a moment. "The cognitive capacity clause," she said. "That's aggressive. Someone's been planning this for a while." "At least 7 months," I said. "Do you want to stop the party, or do you want to use it?" I thought about that for exactly 4 seconds. "Use it," I said. "I want to be precise about how I spent the following 2 weeks, because the sequence matters. I didn't confront my son. I didn't change my behavior with his wife. I attended a project review dinner at their home in Lincoln Park and ate my daughter-in-law's braised short ribs and admired their renovation and bounced my grandson on my knee for 40 minutes after dessert. I told my son his design proposal for the new Southside Library branch was the best work the firm had produced in 5 years, which was true. I said it in front of his wife, and I watched both of them watching me with the particular warmth that I now understood was not entirely what it appeared to be. That was the hardest part. Not the anger. The anger was manageable. It was the grief underneath it. The grief of recalibrating every memory of the past several years through a new lens, and finding that the memories themselves hadn't changed, but their meaning had. I remembered my son mentioning at Easter that I'd forgotten to return a client call. I remembered his wife suggesting, gently, that I might want to let the younger architects handle the more technically demanding proposals. I remembered a dinner conversation about succession planning that I had interpreted as thoughtful and long-range, and now interpreted differently. They had been patient. That was the word that kept returning to me. Patient in the way that people are patient when they have a plan and they know the outcome is already arranged. I retrieved copies of the supplemental documents through Patricia, who obtained them through appropriate legal channels without my son or his wife being notified. I read pages 12 through 18 3 times. The language was exactly as Diane had described, careful, technically legal, and designed to be invisible to someone who trusted the people handing him the pen. Patricia filed the preliminary documents to amend my existing will. Everything held in my name, including my equity in Callaway Design, would pass to a charitable trust in the event of my incapacity or death, managed by a 3-person board that included Harris, Patricia, and the director of a youth architecture program I'd funded for 12 years. My son would receive a generous annual income from the trust for the duration of his life. He would not control the firm. I also retained a separate attorney for a corporate matter, one completely unrelated to any firm my son knew I used, and restructured the ownership of the building where Callaway Design had its offices. I owned that building outright. I had for 23 years. I moved it into a separate LLC with a 5-year lease to the firm at market rate. If someone wanted to absorb Callaway Design into a holding entity, they would find that the ground under the building had different ownership than they'd assumed. The details always matter most. On the Thursday before the party, my son called me in the early evening. He asked if I was feeling good about the event, whether the restaurant had confirmed all the arrangements, whether I was nervous about the speech. I told him I was looking forward to it more than anything in recent memory. That was also true. The morning of the party, I drove to the office before 7. I wanted the quiet of an empty building and the particular clarity that comes with early winter light coming off the lake. I made coffee in the small kitchen on the 3rd floor and sat at the drafting table I'd kept in the corner of my office for sentimental reasons, the one I'd used in the original rented space on Damon Avenue before we had anything you could call a real firm. I had a single legal pad in front of me and I wrote my speech longhand, the way I'd always written the things that mattered. Not a revenge speech, not a courtroom speech. I'd thought carefully about the difference. What I wanted was clarity. Public, documented, witness clarity about exactly what Arthur Calloway was and wasn't signing, and why, and with full understanding of every word on every page. If my son and his wife had spent 7 months building a record of my supposed diminishment, I was going to spend 45 minutes in front of 47 people demonstrating, in the most precise terms available to me, exactly how sharp my mind remained. Patricia arrived at my office at noon with a thin folder. The documents inside were the ones I would actually sign that evening, not the originals my attorney at Hendricks and Foley had prepared, but a completely new set drafted from scratch, reviewed by 3 independent attorneys, structured to reflect exactly and only what I had always intended. A recognition of my son's contributions, a gradual and conditional transfer of certain operational responsibilities, and the preservation of my controlling equity until such time as I chose, freely and with full legal counsel, to relinquish it. "Are you sure you want to do this publicly?" Patricia asked. The file they were building was public in a way, I said. Witnesses, documented incidents, an attorney who knew both sides of the table. If the record was going to be written about me, I'd rather write part of it myself. She nodded once and left. I put on my best suit, charcoal, not black, the one my wife had picked out for our daughter's college graduation, and drove to Spiaggia. My son and his wife arrived before most of the other guests. He looked exactly as a man should look at his 50th birthday dinner. Slightly overwhelmed, genuinely happy, handsome in a way that still surprised me sometimes because I could still see in his face the boy he had been. His wife wore a dark green dress and kissed my cheek at the door and told me I looked wonderful. I told her she looked wonderful too. I meant it. That's the thing about people who do complicated and wrong things. They are still, in most other respects, recognizable human beings. And that fact doesn't simplify anything. The cocktail hour passed the way good cocktail hours do, with conversation that overlapped and circled, and occasionally produced actual laughter. The junior partners toasted my son in terms that were affectionate and only mildly embarrassing. 2 of our oldest clients, men I'd known for over 2 decades, told stories from the early years of the firm that were mostly accurate. The string quartet played Schubert and then, at my son's request, a quiet arrangement of a Stevie Wonder song his mother had loved. I excused myself during the second course and went briefly to a small anteroom off the main dining room where Patricia was waiting. Diane Marsh was there as well. She had agreed, after some consideration, to be present as a witness to the document signing not for dramatic purposes, but because Patricia had advised that an independent witness with first-hand knowledge of the original documents would be procedurally important if any challenge arose later. I thanked Diane again for calling me. She said she hoped it resolved itself cleanly. I said I hoped so too. Dessert was cleared at 9:15. The room shifted to that particular anticipatory quiet that precedes a formal moment at a dinner party. My son sat at the head of his table, looking slightly flushed and happy, his wife beside him with her hand on his arm. 45 people held champagne flutes or coffee cups and turned toward me as I stood. I didn't use notes. I started with the truth, which is always the easiest place to start. I told them about the firm, about the first office, the drafting table, the commission that nearly broke us in 1987, and the one that saved us in 1988. About the 33 years of learning how to build things that outlasted the people who designed them. About my son's arrival at 28 and what I had seen in him from the beginning, not talent, exactly, though he had that, but a kind of seriousness about the work that told me he understood what it was for. People were nodding. My son's eyes were bright. Then I said, I want to be clear about something tonight, in front of everyone here, because I have found, over 67 years, that the most important things should be said in front of witnesses. The room was very quiet. 3 weeks ago, I received a warning from someone I didn't know. She told me not to sign anything at this party without reading it very carefully. I did read it very carefully. What I found, in a set of documents prepared without my knowledge and embedded in what was supposed to be a straightforward partnership transfer, was language that would have significantly diminished my ownership and authority over the firm I built, and included provisions allowing others to make decisions on my behalf if I were deemed cognitively impaired. The silence in that room was absolute. I want to say this plainly. I am not cognitively impaired. I have never been cognitively impaired. The documented incidents that were assembled to suggest otherwise are either mischaracterized, fabricated, or drawn from situations that were resolved in my favor. I have had all of this reviewed by independent legal counsel, and I have the documentation here if anyone wishes to examine it. I watched my son's face change. It was a slow change, the kind that happens when a person tries very hard to maintain an expression while the structure underneath it gives way. His wife's hand tightened on his arm. She was the faster thinker of the two. She had already understood, in the first 30 seconds, exactly what was happening. The documents I am signing tonight, I continued, are not the documents that were originally prepared for this occasion. They are new documents, drafted by independent counsel, reflecting exactly and only what I actually intend. A formal acknowledgement of my son's contributions to this firm. A structured and conditional pathway for future transition of certain operational responsibilities. And a clear, unambiguous restatement of my controlling equity interest, which will remain exactly where it is until I freely choose otherwise. I turned and looked directly at my son. I love you, I said. I have loved you from the moment I first held you, and I have not stopped for a single day in 50 years. What was planned, whether you understood all of it, whether you authorized every piece of it, whether you told yourself it was for my benefit, I don't know. I may never know all of it. But the people in this room deserve the truth about what almost happened here tonight. And so do you. My son stood up. I thought, for a moment, that he was going to speak. His mouth opened and then closed. He looked at his wife, and whatever he saw in her face confirmed something he had perhaps been allowing himself not to fully know. He sat back down. His wife spoke instead, which was consistent with everything I'd observed over the past 2 weeks about who had been driving this. Richard. Her voice was careful and smooth. This is a misunderstanding. The documents were intended to protect the firm, not to harm you. You've been under enormous stress since my wife died, I said. Yes, I have been under stress since my wife died. That is true. It is also true that grief and incapacity are not the same thing, and anyone who suggested otherwise to an attorney was wrong to do so. She stopped speaking. I have the supplemental agreement, I said. I have the internal memo from Hendricks and Foley. I have the contact records. Patricia stepped into the doorway of the anteroom. She carried a thin stack of folders, one for each guest, which she had prepared in advance. She handed them to a server to distribute. 45 people opened 45 identical folders and read for the first time, in plain language, what had been planned for the controlling owner of a design firm that had built or renovated more than 300 buildings in the city of Chicago. The room did not erupt. It was quieter than that. The quiet of people processing something they did not want to be true and finding, reluctantly, that it was. One of my oldest clients, a developer I'd worked with for 24 years, set down his folder and looked at my son for a long moment without saying anything. The junior partners exchanged a glance. My son's college friend, a man who had known him for nearly 30 years, stood up very quietly and walked out of the dining room. My son finally found his voice. "Dad, if you'd just talk to me." "I gave you every opportunity to talk to me," I said. "I had dinner at your house 11 days ago. I told you your library branch proposal was the best work you'd done in years. I bounced your son on my knee. You had every opportunity to say, 'Dad, I'm worried about the firm's direction. Dad, I'm worried about you.' You said none of those things. Because you thought I would sign." He didn't answer that. The silence held for a long moment. "I'm not asking you to answer for everything tonight," I said. "I'm not a prosecutor. I'm your father. But I need you to understand that what was attempted here, the manufactured record, the embedded language, the coordination with a firm that represented us both without disclosing the conflict, these are not things I can simply forgive in a restaurant over champagne. They have legal implications that my attorney will be addressing separately. They also have personal implications that will take considerably longer to address, if they can be addressed at all." My son's wife stood abruptly. She picked up her clutch from the back of her chair with the practiced composure of a woman who had spent 11 years in corporate law and knew how to exit a room with her spine straight. She leaned down and murmured something to my son. He shook his head once, tightly. She left. My son stayed. That meant something, though I wasn't sure yet exactly what. The party didn't end gracefully. Parties never do when the truth walks in uninvited. Guests filtered out in ones and twos, some stopping to press my hand and say something quiet, others leaving without ceremony because there was nothing adequate to say. The junior partners asked, very carefully, whether the firm's operations would be affected in the short term. I told them no. They looked relieved and then slightly ashamed of looking relieved, which I thought was appropriate. Patricia collected the folders. Diane had already left through the anteroom exit, which I was glad of. She had done her part. Near the end of the evening, when only a few people remained at scattered tables speaking in low voices, my son came and sat across from me in the chair his wife had vacated. He looked like a man who had aged in the past 2 hours, which I suppose was accurate. He said he had not known about all of it. I said I believed him. I did, partially. The truth was probably layered in the way of most family betrayals. Not one person's single decision, but a series of smaller decisions, each one individually rationalized, accumulating into something none of the individual rationalizations had explicitly intended. He said his wife had framed it as protecting me, protecting the firm. He said he had asked questions he didn't push hard enough when the answers were vague. He said he had known, somewhere underneath it, that the timeline was faster than he'd asked for, and the documents were more complicated than they needed to be, and he had not looked closely because he had wanted not to look closely. I told him that was perhaps the most honest thing he'd said in 7 months. He put his face in his hands. I sat with him in that expensive restaurant, in the wreckage of his birthday party, for a long time. The string quartet had packed up. The servers moved quietly around us, resetting tables for the next day's lunch service with the professional indifference of people who had seen every variety of human occasion end badly. Outside, Oak Street Beach was dark, and the lake was invisible against the November sky. My son asked what would happen now. I told him that Patricia would be in contact with Hendricks and Foley regarding the conflict of interest and the unauthorized supplemental documents. I told him that the firm's operations would continue normally under my direction, and that his position remained his for as long as he chose to conduct himself as a partner deserving of the title. I told him that the watch I had bought for his birthday was still on my kitchen counter at home, and that when the time was right, I would give it to him. He asked if that time would ever come. I told him I didn't know yet. That was honest. On the way home, I drove along Lakeshore Drive with the windows cracked despite the cold. Chicago, at 11:30 on a November night, has a specific quality of light. The orange of street lamps diffusing against low clouds, the lake invisible but present, the city running through its quiet mechanical routines on the other side of the glass. I had driven this road more times than I could count, in better circumstances and worse ones. I thought about my wife. I thought about what she would have said driving home from an evening like this. I thought she probably would have said very little for the first 20 minutes, and then offered some observation so precise it would have reorganized everything I was feeling into something I could actually hold. I missed her in the particular way you miss someone whose absence has become the permanent weather of your life. Not sharply, not freshly, just constantly. The building where Callaway Design Group had operated for 31 years came into view as I turned off Lakeshore Drive, 12 floors of glass and steel on the north end of the Streeterville neighborhood, the kind of building that had been considered bold when we moved in and now just looked like part of the city, which is the best thing a building can do. It was still mine. That hadn't changed. The holiday season passed in a way that was functional rather than warm. My son and I spoke on the phone every week. His wife retained her own attorney, which was appropriate given the circumstances, and did not attend the family Christmas gathering at my daughter-in-law's parents' house in Wilmette. My grandson, who was 4 and therefore exempt from all responsibility for adult situations, sat on my lap and fell asleep after dinner with the particular boneless trust of small children, and I held him for a long time without moving so he wouldn't wake up. Hendricks and Foley's managing partner called in January. There was no admission of wrongdoing. There was, however, a transition of my accounts to a separate firm, the return of all files, and a settlement arrangement that Patricia described as favorable given the circumstances. The cognitive capacity clause language, she noted, had since been quietly removed from the standard operating agreements the firm used for similar transfers. I took some satisfaction in that, not personally but structurally. Other people would be protected by that change who would never know it had happened. My son hired his own attorney as well, separately from his wife. That separation was its own kind of information. In February, on the coldest day of the year, when the wind off the lake made the temperature feel like something out of a survival manual, I drove downtown to the office and worked until 7 in the evening on the South Side Library branch proposal. My son was there too, at the drafting table next to mine, and we worked in the way we had always worked well together, mostly in silence, occasionally asking each other questions, the work itself functioning as a kind of language that bypassed the other things neither of us was quite ready to say. At 7:15 he put down his pencil and said, "The overhang on the east entrance is wrong. The shadow modeling doesn't account for the afternoon angle in summer." I looked at it. He was right. "Fix it," I said. He fixed it. We sat there for another hour in the warm light of the drafting table. 2 architects working on a building that would exist in the physical world long after both of us were gone. Outside the window, Lake Michigan was iron gray and carrying white caps all the way to the horizon. The city ran its routines on the other side of the glass. I reached into my desk drawer and set the watch box on the table between us. He looked at it for a moment without touching it. "Dad, the engraving says, 'For the work, for what comes next.' I had it done before I knew any of this. I kept it because the sentiment is still true." I paused. "What you do with the rest of it, the marriage, the decisions you made, the ones you made yourself, and the ones you went along with, those are yours to figure out. I can't do that for you." He picked up the box. "The firm is still yours someday," I said. "When I decide, when I'm ready, when the documents say exactly what they mean and nothing else. Not before. I know. And you earn it. The way I did. I know that too." He opened the box. He looked at the watch for a long time without saying anything. Then he put it on. It was a little large on his wrist. My son has always been thinner than I expected. But he adjusted the clasp with the careful attention he brought to details that mattered. And when it was set, he held it up slightly and looked at it the way men look at things they intend to keep. The lake had gone dark outside the window. Chicago was going about its business, indifferent and immense, and full of buildings that told the story of everyone who had ever decided to build something and refused to stop when it got hard. I picked up my pencil and went back to work. That's what you do. That's what it means to still be here. You pick up the pencil and you go back to work. And you build things that outlast you. And you hold on to the things that matter with both hands, and you trust your instincts when they tell you something is wrong, even when trusting them costs you the most. Especially then,